The gunshot that killed Samuel Foster's hope didn't come from a revolver but from the doctor's mouth when he said there was nothing more he could do. It was September of 1877, and the fever had already taken Samuel's wife Margaret and their 2 young sons within the span of a week, leaving him standing in the doorway of their small ranch house outside Pecos, Texas, staring at 3 wooden crosses he had hammered into the unforgiving earth with his own trembling hands. Samuel was 26 years old, tall and lean with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes the color of storm clouds. He had built a life here in West Texas with Margaret, carved it out of the desert with determination and love, raised cattle on land that fought him every step of the way. They had been happy despite the hardships, despite the isolation, despite the brutal summers and the occasional Apache raids that sent everyone in the territory scrambling for cover. But happiness, Samuel learned, could be stripped away faster than flesh from bone when sickness came calling. The fever had started with his youngest boy, Thomas, who was only 4. Then it spread to 7-year-old William, and finally to Margaret, who had exhausted herself caring for the children. Samuel had ridden hard to Pecos to fetch Dr. Morrison, but the old man had shaken his head grimly and said it was cholera, or maybe typhoid, and either way there was little to be done but pray and keep them comfortable. Samuel had watched helplessly as his family withered before his eyes, their bodies racked with fever and chills, their lips cracked and bleeding. Margaret had died last, holding his hand and whispering his name, and when her grip finally loosened, Samuel felt something inside him die too. The neighbors came with food and condolences. They told him time would heal the wound, that he was young and could start again. But Samuel couldn't imagine starting anything. He went through the motions of living like a man walking through water, everything slow and heavy and wrong. He tended his cattle because they needed tending. He fixed fences because they needed fixing. He ate because his body demanded it. But he felt nothing, wanted nothing, hoped for nothing. 3 months passed this way. December came and brought cold winds that howled across the plains like wounded animals. Samuel spent his days working himself into exhaustion, and his nights sitting by the fireplace in the house that echoed with absence, drinking whiskey until sleep finally claimed him. He spoke to no one unless necessary. He avoided town. He existed, nothing more. It was on a bitter cold morning in late December when Samuel rode into Pecos for supplies. The town was small but growing, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. There was a general store, a saloon, a boarding house, a church, and a handful of other establishments that served the ranchers and drifters who passed through. Samuel tied his horse outside Carson's general store and went inside, nodding curtly to old Pete Carson behind the counter. He was gathering flour and coffee when he heard the raised voices from outside. Through the store's window he could see a small crowd gathering near the boarding house across the street. Smoke was visible, thin and gray, rising from behind the building. Samuel's first instinct was to ignore it, to collect his supplies and leave, but something made him set down his purchases and walk outside. The smoke was coming from a small cabin behind the boarding house, flames licking at the wooden walls while people shouted and ran with buckets of water. It was a futile effort. The cabin was old and dry as tinder, and the fire spread with terrifying speed. Samuel found himself moving toward it without thinking, his body remembering how to act even if his heart didn't care. Is anyone inside? He called to a man throwing water uselessly at the flames. There was a woman. She got out but ran back in for something. Samuel didn't hesitate. He pulled his bandana over his mouth and nose and kicked open the door, which was already charred and weak. Heat slammed into him like a physical blow, and smoke filled his lungs despite the cloth covering his face. He could barely see through the thick gray haze, but he moved forward, calling out. "Where are you? Call out." A cough answered him, then a weak voice from somewhere to his left. "Here." "I'm here." Samuel followed the sound, his eyes streaming, his lungs burning. He found her crumpled on the floor near what looked like a burning dresser, her dress smoking, her hair wild around her soot-stained face. She was clutching something to her chest, a small wooden box, and she looked up at him with eyes wide with fear and determination. "I've got you," Samuel said, and he scooped her up in his arms, box and all. She was light, too light, and she coughed violently against his chest as he turned and ran for the door. Behind them, something collapsed with a roar of sparks and flame. Samuel burst through the doorway just as part of the roof caved in, stumbling into the cold air and falling to his knees several yards from the burning structure. People rushed forward to help. Someone took the woman from his arms. Someone else pressed a cup of water to his lips. Samuel coughed and spat, his throat raw, his eyes burning. When his vision cleared, he looked for the woman he had pulled from the fire and saw her sitting on the ground nearby, still clutching that wooden box, staring at the flames consuming what must have been her home. She was young, probably close to his own age, with long dark hair that was singed at the ends and a face smudged with soot. Even through the grime he could see she was beautiful, with high cheekbones and a straight nose and lips pressed together in a thin line of grief. Her dress was burned at the hem and her hands were blistered, but she seemed unaware of her injuries. She just watched the cabin burn, tears making clean tracks down her dirty cheeks. Dr. Morrison appeared and began fussing over both of them. He treated the woman's burns and checked Samuel's breathing, pronouncing them both lucky to be alive. The woman said nothing during the examination, just held that box tighter. Samuel wanted to leave, to return to his solitude, but something kept him there, watching her. Finally, when the cabin was nothing but smoking ruins and the crowd had dispersed, Samuel approached her. She was sitting on a bench outside the boarding house, still holding the box, staring at nothing. "You all right?" he asked, his voice rough from smoke. She looked up at him slowly, as if she had forgotten he existed. Her eyes were green, he noticed, the color of bottled glass, and they held a depth of pain he recognized. "I'm alive," she said. It wasn't an answer to his question, not really. "What was in the box?" Samuel asked. "Must have been important." She looked down at it, then opened the lid. Inside were photographs, a few letters, a small doll made of cloth. "Everything I have left of them," she said softly. "My family, my parents, my little sister. They died 2 years ago in Denver when our house burned. I was away visiting my aunt. When I came back, there was nothing left but ashes and graves." Samuel felt something crack in the ice around his heart, a small fissure but a real one. He sat down beside her without being invited. "I'm sorry." "Everyone's sorry," she said, not unkindly. "Being sorry doesn't bring them back." "No, it doesn't." They sat in silence for a while, two broken people on a bench in a dusty Texas town, watching the last wisps of smoke rise into the pale winter sky. Finally, she spoke again. "Thank you for coming in after me. That was foolish and brave." "Mostly foolish," Samuel said. "Maybe." She turned to look at him properly. "What's your name?" "Samuel Foster. People call me Sam." "I'm Victoria Summers. Victoria, not Vicky." "All right, Victoria." She closed the box and held it in her lap. "I came here 3 months ago. Thought a new place might help. I've been working at the boarding house, cleaning rooms and helping with meals. Mrs. Henderson lets me stay in that cabin in exchange for the work. Let me, I suppose I should say. Past tense now. What will you do?" Victoria looked at him with those green eyes that held too much sorrow for someone so young. "I don't know. I suppose I'll figure something out. I always do. Samuel found himself saying something he hadn't planned. I have a ranch about 5 miles from here. It's not much, but there's room. I could use help with cooking and mending and such, if you need a place to stay while you get your feet under you. Victoria studied him carefully, weighing the offer and the man making it. Samuel wondered what she saw. A grimy stranger who had pulled her from a fire, a potential threat. A desperate, lonely man. All of those things were true in their way. Why would you help me? She asked. Samuel thought about that. Because someone should. Because you need help and I can give it. Because maybe helping you is something I can do when I can't do anything else. It was more honesty than he had intended, and he saw understanding flicker in her eyes. She recognized something in him, the same thing he had seen in her. The mark of loss. The weight of grief. All right, she said. I accept, but I'll work for my keep. I'm not a charity case. Wouldn't dream of suggesting you were. They shook hands, her small blistered palm against his smoke-stained one, and made an arrangement that neither of them quite understood, but both of them needed. Victoria gathered the few possessions she had managed to save, which amounted to little more than the clothes on her back, the box of memories, and a coat Mrs. Henderson gave her from the lost and found. Samuel finished purchasing his supplies, and by early afternoon they were riding out of Pico's together, Victoria sitting behind him on his horse because she had no mount of her own. The ride to the ranch was quiet. Victoria held onto Samuel's waist loosely, properly, and looked at the harsh landscape spreading around them. West Texas was a hard land, all scrub brush and mesquite and endless sky. The wind was cold and constant, cutting through clothes and pulling at hair. In the distance, mountains rose like brown teeth against the horizon. Is it always this bleak? Victoria asked. Mostly, Samuel said. Gets green for a few weeks in spring if we get rain. Rest of the time it looks pretty much like this. And you chose to live here, my wife and I did. Thought we could make something out of nothing. Turns out we were half right. Victoria didn't ask about his wife. She had heard the past tense in his voice and understood what it meant. They rode on in silence until the ranch came into view. It was a modest spread, a small wooden house with a porch, a barn, a few corrals, and a windmill that creaked as it turned. Cattle grazed on the sparse grass, maybe 60 head, their brands visible even from a distance. Everything looked neat and maintained but joyless, functional without beauty. Samuel helped Victoria down from the horse and showed her inside. The house was simple, a main room with a fireplace and kitchen area, 2 smaller bedrooms, and a loft accessible by ladder. It was clean but sparse, and there was a heaviness in the air, a sense of absence that made Victoria shiver despite the fire Samuel built in the hearth. You can have the back bedroom, Samuel said, pointing. I sleep in the front one. There's bedding in the chest and water in the pitcher. Not much, but it's dry and warm. It's more than I had an hour ago, Victoria said. Thank you, Samuel. Sam, he corrected. And you're welcome. They established a routine quickly, born of necessity and mutual understanding. Victoria took over the cooking and cleaning, mended Samuel's clothes, and kept the house in order. She was a hard worker, up before dawn to make breakfast, busy throughout the day with tasks that needed doing. Samuel tended the cattle and maintained the property, fixing what broke and building what was needed. They spoke little at first, circling each other like wary animals, respecting boundaries and grief. But slowly, gradually, things began to change. Samuel found himself looking forward to meals, not because he was hungry, but because it meant sitting across from Victoria and hearing her voice. She told him about her life in Denver, about her parents who had run a small bakery, about her sister Clara who had been only 8 when she died. She talked about the guilt she carried for being away when they needed her, for surviving when they hadn't. "I was at my aunt's house in Colorado Springs," she said one evening as they ate stew by the fireplace. "Just a visit, supposed to be gone for a week. My aunt was sick and Mother wanted me to help care for her. While I was gone, a lantern got knocked over in the bakery. The whole building went up. They were sleeping upstairs. By the time the neighbors got them out, the smoke had already taken them." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly around her spoon. Samuel watched her across the table and felt his own pain mirror hers. "I lost my wife and sons to fever," he said. 3 months ago. Happened so fast there was no time to prepare, no time to say proper goodbyes. One week they were here and laughing and alive, and the next I was digging graves. How old were your boys? 4 and 7, Thomas and William. And your wife, Margaret, she was 24. We had been married 8 years. Victoria reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. It was the first intentional contact between them since that day in town, and Samuel felt it like an electric shock. Her fingers were warm despite the winter cold seeping through the walls. "We're a pair, aren't we?" she said softly. "Both trying to figure out how to keep breathing when everything that mattered is gone." "Is that what we're doing?" "I wasn't sure. I think so. I think that's exactly what we're doing." Christmas came and went without celebration. They marked the day by resting from work and eating a better meal than usual, but neither of them had the heart for anything more festive. The new year of 1878 arrived with cold rain that turned the ranch to mud and made everything miserable. Samuel and Victoria worked side by side during those hard weeks, battling the weather and tending to cattle that needed extra care in the cold. It was during one of those frozen January nights that Samuel woke to the sound of crying. He lay in his bed for a moment, disoriented, thinking perhaps he had dreamed it. Then he heard it again, muffled but unmistakable, coming from Victoria's room. He rose and padded quietly to her door, hesitating with his hand raised to knock. "Victoria," he called softly. "You all right?" The crying stopped abruptly. There was a long pause, then her voice, thick with tears. "I'm fine. Go back to bed." Samuel should have listened, should have respected her privacy and returned to his room. Instead, he opened the door and stepped inside. Victoria was sitting up in bed, her face wet with tears, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked young and vulnerable and utterly heartbroken. "Bad dream?" Samuel asked. "Bad memories," she said. "Sometimes they come at night. I dream I'm back in Denver, running toward the house, and I can see the flames and hear them screaming, but no matter how fast I run, I can never reach them in time. I wake up, and for a moment I forget they're gone, and then I remember, and it's like losing them all over again." Samuel sat on the edge of her bed without thinking, without planning. "I know. I dream Margaret is calling me, asking me to help her to save the boys. I try, but my feet won't move, and I have to watch them slip away." Victoria looked at him, and in the dim light from the moon filtering through the window, he saw his own agony reflected in her face. Without discussing it, without questioning it, they reached for each other. It wasn't romantic or passionate. It was simply two people in terrible pain, seeking comfort in the only other person who understood. They held each other and they cried, and Samuel felt something in his chest loosen, some tightly wound spring finally releasing. They fell asleep that way, tangled together on top of the blankets, fully clothed, holding on like drowning swimmers clutching driftwood. When Samuel woke in the gray light of dawn, Victoria was still in his arms, her head on his chest, her breathing slow and even. He knew he should move, should disentangle himself before things became awkward, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. This was the first peace he had felt in months, The first morning he had woken without immediately being crushed by the weight of loss. Victoria stirred and opened her eyes. For a moment she looked confused, then awareness returned and she tensed, pulling back slightly to look at his face. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to fall apart on you. Don't apologize. I fell apart on you too." She smiled slightly, the first real smile he had seen from her. It transformed her face, made her look younger and lighter. "We're quite the pair of broken people, aren't we? Maybe we are, but maybe broken people need each other." They rose and went about their day, but something had shifted between them. The careful distance they had maintained began to crumble. They talked more freely, shared more openly. Victoria told Samuel about the man she had been courting in Denver before the fire, how she had broken things off afterward because she couldn't imagine building a future when the past kept dragging her under. Samuel told Victoria about his courtship with Margaret, how they had met at a church social in Fort Worth, and how she had agreed to come west with him even though everyone told her she was crazy. "She was brave," Victoria said one evening as they cleaned up after supper. "Coming out here, building a life in such a hard place." "She was," Samuel agreed. "She never complained, never said she regretted it. Even at the end, even when she was dying, she told me she had been happy." "That's a good thing to know, that she was happy. It should be. But it makes me angry too sometimes. She deserved more time. They all did." Victoria dried a plate and set it carefully on the shelf. "Anger is better than numbness. I was numb for a long time after they died. Couldn't feel anything at all. When the anger finally came, I thought it would destroy me, but instead it gave me something to push against, something to fight through. What came after the anger? I'm still figuring that out, but I think maybe it's something like acceptance. Not forgetting, never that, but learning to carry the weight without letting it crush you." Samuel considered this as he wiped down the table. "And how do you learn that? I don't know. Maybe by finding something worth carrying it for." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. They finished cleaning in comfortable silence, then sat by the fire as had become their habit, reading or talking or simply being present together. February brought warmer weather and the first hints of spring. The cattle began to fatten on new grass, and Samuel started making plans for the season ahead. He would need to hire help for the roundup and the drive to market, would need to make repairs that had been neglected. Victoria threw herself into her own projects, planting a vegetable garden near the house and repairing curtains that had gone threadbare. One afternoon, Samuel returned from checking the water supply at the windmill to find Victoria standing in front of the 3 graves behind the house. He had thought about moving them, or at least putting up a fence to separate them from the rest of the property, but he hadn't been able to bring himself to do it. Now he saw Victoria kneeling beside the smallest cross, her fingers tracing the name he had burned into the wood. Thomas Foster. Samuel approached quietly. "I should have told you they were here. I'm sorry if it's upsetting." Victoria looked up at him and her eyes were sad but not frightened. "It's not upsetting. It's right. They should be here near you, near home." "Sometimes I talk to them," Samuel admitted. "Tell them about my day, about what's happening. I know they can't hear me, but it makes me feel less alone." "I do the same thing," Victoria said. "I talk to Clara, tell her about Texas, about the ranch, about you, about me." She stood and brushed dirt from her skirt. "I tell her I met someone who understands, someone who lost his family too, someone who is helping me remember how to be alive." Samuel felt his heart beat faster. "That's what you're doing for me too." They stood facing each other in the shadow of the graves, and Samuel saw something change in Victoria's expression. She reached out and took his hand, not briefly this time but deliberately, holding it as if it were something precious. "I think we've been helping each other," she said. And I think maybe we could keep doing that, if you wanted to. Samuel understood what she was offering, not a declaration of love, not yet, but an acknowledgement of possibility, a willingness to try. He had thought his heart died with Margaret, that he would never feel anything for another woman, but standing here with Victoria, he realized that wasn't true. What he felt was different from what he had felt for his wife, not better or worse, but its own thing entirely. It was like finding water in a desert, unexpected and life-giving. I want to, he said, but I'm afraid of dishonoring Margaret's memory, afraid of losing someone again, afraid of wanting something and having it ripped away. I'm afraid too, Victoria said. Afraid of letting myself care and being left alone again, afraid of building something just to watch it burn, but I'm more afraid of going through life never taking the risk. Samuel squeezed her hand. Then maybe we take the risk together, slowly, carefully. Slowly and carefully, Victoria agreed. They stood there a while longer, holding hands beside the graves of Samuel's family, making a quiet promise to each other and to themselves. When they finally turned back toward the house, something had fundamentally changed. They weren't just two lonely people sharing space anymore. They were two people choosing to build something together, deliberately and with open eyes. The courtship that followed was unlike any traditional romance. There were no fancy dinners or formal dances, no poetry or flowers. What they had was harder and more real. They worked together during the day and talked late into the night, sharing their fears and hopes, their memories and dreams. Samuel told Victoria about the plans he had made with Margaret, the children they had hoped to have, the future that had been stolen. Victoria told Samuel about her guilt and her nightmares, about the way she still sometimes caught herself thinking about Clara as if her sister were alive, only to remember the truth with fresh pain. They were honest with each other in a way that was almost brutal, stripping away pretense, because they had nothing left to hide behind. And in that honesty, they found something solid to build on. Samuel started noticing small things about Victoria. The way she hummed while she worked. The way she pushed her hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. The way her whole face lit up when she smiled, which was happening more and more often. He found himself thinking about her at odd moments during the day, wondering what she was doing, whether she was happy. Victoria noticed things about Samuel too. The way he was gentler with the cattle than he let on. The way he sometimes stood on the porch at sunset, just looking at the horizon with an expression of deep loneliness. The way his rare smiles made her stomach flutter. She caught herself watching him when he didn't know she was looking, admiring the way he moved, the quiet competence of his hands. It was a Sunday in late March when Samuel made his move. They had ridden into Pico's for church services, something Victoria had requested and Samuel had reluctantly agreed to. Afterward, as they were preparing to ride home, Samuel stopped at the small jewelry stand run by a traveling merchant who came through once a month. "Can I help you?" The merchant asked, a thin man with a waxed mustache. Samuel looked at the modest selection of rings and necklaces, then pointed to a simple silver band with a small turquoise stone. "How much for that one?" $5. "It's real turquoise from New Mexico, good quality." Samuel paid without haggling and slipped the ring into his pocket. Victoria was waiting by the horses, talking to Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house, and she didn't see the transaction. They rode home in comfortable silence, and Samuel thought about how and when to give her the ring, whether she would accept it, whether he was moving too fast. He decided to wait until after supper, but his nervousness made him clumsy. He burned the bread and over-salted the stew, earning a curious look from Victoria. "Are you all right?" she asked. "You seem distracted." "I'm fine, just thinking." "About what?" Samuel set down his spoon and looked at her across the table. The lamplight made her hair glow auburn and cast soft shadows on her face. She was beautiful, but more than that, she was strong and kind and brave. She was someone he could imagine building a life with, someone he wanted to wake up beside. "Victoria," he said, then stopped, unsure how to continue. "Yes." He pulled the ring from his pocket and set it on the table between them. Victoria stared at it, then at him, her eyes wide. "I know we haven't been doing this long," Samuel said, "and I know we're both still grieving, still healing. But I also know that you make me want to live again, not just exist. You make me think about the future instead of just surviving the present. I care about you, Victoria, more than I thought I could care about anyone after losing Margaret, and I'm wondering if maybe you feel the same way." Victoria reached out and touched the ring with one finger, not picking it up, just tracing the silver band. "Are you asking me to marry you? I'm asking if you would consider it. Eventually. When we're both ready. I'm asking if you could see yourself staying here, not as my employee or my housekeeper, but as my partner, as my wife." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Yes, yes, I can see that, but you're right, we need time. We need to make sure we're doing this for the right reasons, not just because we're lonely or scared. How much time? I don't know. Enough to be sure. Enough to know that what we feel is real and lasting." Samuel picked up the ring and held it out to her. "Then wear this as a promise. A promise that we're trying, that we're moving towards something. And when we're both ready, when we're both sure, we'll make it official." Victoria took the ring and slipped it onto her left hand. It fit perfectly, the turquoise catching the lamplight. She looked at it, then at Samuel, and her smile was radiant. "All right. I promise." They reached across the table and held hands, the ring warm between their palms, and Samuel felt hope bloom in his chest like a flower in the desert. It was fragile and new, but it was real. The next months were the happiest Samuel could remember since before the fever. He and Victoria worked together to improve the ranch, building new corrals and repairing the barn roof. They hired 2 ranch hands for the summer, brothers named Jack and Tom Murphy, who bunked in the barn and helped with the heavy work. The cattle thrived, and when Samuel drove them to market in late summer, he got a good price that would see them through the winter with money to spare. Victoria transformed the house. She made new curtains and planted flowers around the porch. She filled the place with small touches that made it feel like a home instead of just a shelter. Samuel found himself smiling more, laughing even at Victoria's dry humor and quick wit. They danced in the kitchen one evening when she was teaching him a waltz her father had taught her, both of them clumsy and laughing as they stumbled over each other's feet. They kissed for the first time in May, under a sky full of stars. They had been sitting on the porch after a long day of work, comfortable and quiet, when Samuel had turned to Victoria and seen her looking at him with an expression of such tenderness, it stole his breath. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when their lips met, it felt like coming home and discovering something new all at once. The kiss was gentle and sweet, full of promise. "I love you," Victoria whispered when they pulled apart. "I didn't think I could feel this way again, but I do. I love you, Samuel Foster." "I love you too," Samuel said, and saying it felt like healing. He had loved Margaret, would always love her memory, but this was different. This was a second chance, a new beginning. "I want to marry you, soon." Not as a promise, but for real. "Yes," Victoria said simply. "Yes, let's do that." They were married in June of 1878 in the small church in Pecos with most of the town in attendance. Victoria wore a dress she had sewn herself from blue fabric Samuel had bought in El Paso, and Samuel wore his best suit, cleaned and pressed. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony, and when Samuel slipped a proper gold wedding band onto Victoria's finger next to the silver promise ring, His hand was steady and sure. The celebration afterward was modest but joyful. People brought food and music, and there was dancing in the street until late in the evening. Mrs. Henderson hugged Victoria and told her she was glad to see her happy. Dr. Morrison clapped Samuel on the shoulder and said he was proud to see him choosing life. Old Pete Carson gave them a set of fine china as a wedding gift, carefully wrapped and precious. When they finally returned to the ranch that night, Samuel carried Victoria over the threshold as tradition demanded, and they both laughed at the absurdity and rightness of it. This was their home now, not his or hers, but theirs. A place they would build together. Their wedding night was tender and careful, two people learning each other with patience and care. Victoria was nervous because it was her first time, and Samuel was gentle because he understood. They took their time, murmuring reassurances and promises, and when they finally came together it felt sacred, like a vow renewed and strengthened. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Victoria's head on his chest and her hair spilling across his shoulder, Samuel felt at peace for the first time since the fever had taken his family. He thought about Margaret and the boys, and instead of crushing pain, he felt gentle sadness mixed with gratitude. He had loved them and been loved by them, and that was precious. But life continued, and he was allowed to live it, to find joy again without diminishing what had come before. "What are you thinking about?" Victoria asked sleepily. "That I'm grateful for you, for this, for getting a second chance." "Me too," she said. She lifted her head to look at him in the dim moonlight filtering through the window. "Do you think they would approve? Your family, I mean, and mine." Samuel thought about it seriously. "Yes, I think they would want us to be happy. I think they would understand that loving each other doesn't mean we've forgotten them. I hope so. I want to believe they're somewhere watching over us, glad we found each other. Then let's believe that." Victoria settled back against his chest and was asleep within minutes. Samuel lay awake a while longer, listening to her breathe, feeling the weight of her against him, marveling at the strange path that had led them both here. Loss and fire and fever and grief, all of it terrible, but somehow it had brought them together. He couldn't call any of it good, but he could find meaning in where it had led. Eventually, he slept. The first year of their marriage was good. They worked hard and prospered modestly. The ranch grew as Samuel bought more cattle with his profits. Victoria's garden flourished, providing vegetables that she canned for winter. They attended church services most Sundays and made friends in town. They were building a life, piece by piece, day by day. Victoria discovered she was pregnant in early spring of 1879. She told Samuel one morning at breakfast, nervous and excited all at once, watching his face for his reaction. Samuel felt his breath catch. A child. He had been a father before and lost that, and the thought of trying again was both thrilling and terrifying. But looking at Victoria's hopeful expression, he knew there was only one response. "That's wonderful," he said, getting up to pull her into his arms. "That's the best news I could imagine." "You're not frightened." "I'm terrified, but I'm also happy. We're going to have a baby, Victoria, our baby." She hugged him tight. "I'm scared too. After everything we've both lost, I'm scared something will go wrong, but I'm also excited. I want this. I want a family with you." "Then that's what we'll have." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Victoria bloomed despite the summer heat, her face glowing and her spirits high. Samuel doted on her, insisting she rest more and work less, though she rolled her eyes at his hovering. Dr. Morrison checked on her regularly and pronounced everything healthy and normal. As Victoria's belly grew, Samuel found himself visiting the 3 graves behind the house more often. He would stand there in the evening light and talk to Margaret and the boys, telling them about Victoria and the baby, about how he was trying to be a good husband again, how he hoped he could be a good father again, too. "I'll always love you," he told them. "You'll always be part of me. But I'm building something new now, and I hope you understand. I hope you're proud of me for not giving up." The wind whispered through the grass, and Samuel chose to interpret it as approval. Their son was born on a cold November night in 1879, after hours of labor that had Samuel pacing and praying and generally being useless. Dr. Morrison and Mrs. Henderson attended the birth while Samuel waited outside, listening to Victoria's cries and feeling helpless. When the baby finally arrived, healthy and screaming, Samuel rushed in to find Victoria exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny wrinkled bundle. "It's a boy," she said, her voice hoarse. "A perfect, healthy boy." Samuel looked at his son, at the tiny red face and waving fists, and felt love slam into him like a physical force. This was his child, his and Victoria's, a new life they had created together. "What should we name him?" he asked. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but never settled on one. Now Victoria looked thoughtful. "I want to honor those we've lost, but I don't want to name him after them. He needs to be his own person, not a replacement." "I agree." "What about James? James Henry Foster?" "James was my father's name and Henry was your father's." Samuel tried the name out. "James Henry Foster. It's good. It's strong." He looked at his wife and son, his family, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude and love. "Hello, James. Welcome to the world." Baby James was a good child, healthy and happy. He nursed well and slept reasonably, and as he grew, he revealed a disposition that was curious and cheerful. Victoria proved to be a natural mother, patient and loving, and Samuel found that the skills he had learned with Thomas and William came back to him. He changed diapers and walked the floor with a colicky baby and sang lullabies in his rough voice. The pain of losing his first family never completely disappeared, but it changed shape. Instead of a constant crushing weight, it became something he carried with him always, but that no longer prevented him from living. He could think of Thomas and William without breaking down. He could remember happy moments with Margaret without being destroyed by the knowledge that she was gone. The grief became part of his landscape, present but not overwhelming. Victoria experienced something similar. She still had nightmares sometimes about the fire in Denver, still occasionally woke crying. But they came less frequently, and Samuel was always there to hold her and remind her she was safe. She kept her box of memories on a shelf in their bedroom, and sometimes she would take it down and show James the photographs of his grandparents and aunt, telling him stories about them so they wouldn't be forgotten. They were building something real and lasting, a family and a life that honored the past without being trapped by it. When James was 2 years old, Victoria became pregnant again. This time the news was met with excitement rather than fear. They had done this before now. They knew they could handle whatever came. The pregnancy was harder than the first, with Victoria suffering from sickness that lasted well into the 4th month, but she bore it with good humor and determination. Their daughter was born in summer of 1882. A tiny dark-haired girl who came into the world screaming her displeasure at the heat and the brightness and everything else. They named her Clara Margaret Foster, honoring both Victoria's sister and Samuel's first wife, feeling that enough time had passed that it was right to carry those names forward. Clara was feistier than James had been, demanding and loud and utterly charming. James was fascinated by his baby sister, bringing her things and patting her head gently while Victoria nursed. Samuel watched his growing family with wonder, still sometimes unable to believe this was his life now. The ranch continued to prosper. Samuel hired more permanent help as the herd grew, and he and Victoria discussed building a larger house, something with more bedrooms and a proper dining room. They had money saved now, enough to make improvements and think about expansion. But more important than the financial success was the emotional healing both of them had undergone. They still had hard days when grief ambushed them, when memories were too sharp and loss too present. But those days were fewer now, and they had learned how to weather them together. They had learned that healing didn't mean forgetting, that you could honor the dead while still living fully. One evening in autumn of 1883, when James was almost 4 and Clara was learning to walk, Samuel and Victoria sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The children were inside, supposedly sleeping but more likely playing quietly in the darkness. The ranch stretched around them, peaceful and productive, a testament to years of hard work. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" Victoria asked. "If the fever hadn't come to your family, if the fire hadn't happened to mine, we never would have met." "I think about it sometimes," Samuel admitted, "and I don't know how to feel. I would give anything to have prevented those tragedies. But then I wouldn't have James and Clara. It's like trying to untangle a knot made of joy and sorrow all wound together." "I feel the same way. I miss my family terribly, still dream about them, still wish I could have saved them. But I also wouldn't trade what we have for anything. Does that make me a terrible person?" Samuel reached over and took her hand. "It makes you human. We're allowed to be grateful for what we have even while mourning what we lost. They're not mutually exclusive." Victoria squeezed his fingers. "When I first came here, I was so broken I couldn't imagine ever feeling whole again. But you helped me put the pieces back together. You gave me a reason to keep going. You did the same for me. I was just going through the motions, waiting to die until you showed up. You reminded me there were things worth living for. We found each other when we both needed finding. We did." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and stars began to appear. Inside, they heard Clara cry out and then James's young voice soothing her, telling her a story. Samuel smiled. His son was going to be a good big brother, protective and kind. "We should have more," Victoria said suddenly. "More children, yes. I come from a big family and I always imagined having lots of children, and I think this place could handle more. What do you think?" Samuel thought about it. More children meant more work, more worry, more risk, but it also meant more love, more laughter, more life. And after everything they had been through, choosing life seemed like the right answer. "I think that sounds perfect," he said. They had 3 more children over the next 6 years. Another boy they named David, born in 1884. Twin girls, Alice and Alina, born in 1887. The house they built in 1885 had 6 bedrooms and was full of noise and chaos and happiness. Samuel hired more ranch hands and eventually a foreman to help manage the growing operation. Victoria had help with the house and children, a young woman named Sarah who came from town 3 days a week to cook and clean. The ranch became known throughout West Texas as a successful operation, but more than that, it became a home. Samuel and Victoria were known as fair employers and good neighbors. They helped out when others struggled, donated to the church, welcomed travelers with hospitality. They built something that mattered, something that would last. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1888, Samuel took Victoria into Pico's for a proper celebration. They left the children with Mrs. Henderson, who had become like a grandmother to them, and went to the hotel restaurant for dinner. It was the fanciest place in town, with white tablecloths and candles and a menu written in cursive. "This is lovely," Victoria said, looking around with delight. She was 32 now and more beautiful than ever, her face showing the character that came from living fully. "You deserve lovely," Samuel said. "You deserve everything good." They ordered steak and potatoes and shared a bottle of wine that cost more than Samuel usually spent on supplies. They talked about the children and the ranch, about plans for the future and memories of the past. They held hands across the table like young sweethearts, still finding things to say after years of marriage. "You remember the day we met?" Victoria asked. "When you pulled me out of that burning cabin?" "I remember thinking you were either very brave or very foolish to run back in for that box. Both, probably. But I'm glad I did, and I'm glad you came after me. If you hadn't, we might never have spoken, never gotten to know each other." "I would have found a way," Samuel said. "I think we were meant to find each other somehow, too much aligned for it to be just coincidence. You believe in fate. I believe some things are meant to be. I believe that sometimes terrible things happen, and we can't control that, but we can control what we do afterward. We can choose to give up, or we can choose to keep going. We chose to keep going, and that led us here." Victoria's eyes were bright with emotion. "I love you, Samuel Foster. I loved you then, and I love you now, and I'll love you always." "I love you too, Victoria Foster. You saved my life as surely as I saved yours from that fire. You gave me a reason to live again." They finished their meal and walked through the quiet streets of Pecos, arm in arm under a sky full of stars. The town had grown over the years, new buildings and new people, but it was still recognizable as the place where they had met. Samuel thought about that day, about the smoke and the flames and the woman with the box, and he marveled at how far they had come. When they returned to the ranch the next morning, their children rushed to greet them, all talking at once about what they had done and what they had seen. James was 9 now, tall and serious like his father. Clara was 6, fierce and funny. David was 4, cheerful and round-faced. The twins were just over a year old, still unsteady on their feet but determined to keep up with their older siblings. Samuel and Victoria stood on the porch watching their children play in the yard, and Victoria leaned her head against Samuel's shoulder. "We did good," she said softly. "We did," Samuel agreed. "We took broken pieces and built something whole. You still think about them, your first family, every day. But it doesn't hurt the way it used to. Now it's more like looking at an old photograph, something precious from the past, but not something that haunts me." "Do you still think about your family in Denver?" "Yes. I talk to Clara sometimes, my sister I mean, tell her about her namesake. I think she would have loved being an aunt, and I think my parents would be proud of what we've built here. I'm sure they would be." They went inside to help Sarah with lunch, and the house filled with noise and life. James wanted to tell them about a bird's nest he had found. Clara needed help with a torn dress. David demanded to be picked up and carried. The twins cried in harmony, requiring bottles and comfort. It was chaotic and exhausting and absolutely perfect. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges, but also growth and joy. Samuel and Victoria watched their children grow, helping with schoolwork and settling arguments, and teaching them to work hard and treat others with respect. They attended church picnics and town celebrations. They dealt with droughts and cattle sickness and the occasional ranch hand who didn't work out. They had arguments and make-ups, hard times and good times, all the normal rhythms of a long marriage. When James turned 18 in 1897, Samuel deeded him a section of land adjoining the main ranch, helping him start his own operation. James had grown into a fine young man, steady and hardworking, with his father's quiet strength and his mother's sharp wit. He courted a girl from town named Elizabeth, and they were married the following year in the same church where Samuel and Victoria had wed 20 years before. Clara became a teacher, attending normal school in Fort Worth, and returning to teach at the small schoolhouse in Pecos. She was fierce and passionate about education, believing every child deserved the chance to learn. She remained unmarried, claiming she was too busy for romance, though Samuel suspected it had more to do with her high standards than lack of opportunity. David showed a talent for horses, training them with patience and skill. He eventually started a breeding program that became known throughout West Texas for producing quality stock. He married young, at 19, to a rancher's daughter named Mary, and they had 4 children in quick succession. The twins, Alice and Eleanor, were inseparable and full of mischief. They kept Victoria and Samuel on their toes with their schemes and adventures. As they grew older, they became more individual, Alice drawn to ranching and working alongside her father, Eleanor interested in music and art. Both eventually married and settled nearby, staying close to the family they loved. Samuel and Victoria aged together, their hair going gray, their faces gaining lines earned through years of laughter and tears. They remained partners in every sense, running the ranch together, raising their children together, facing whatever came together. They never forgot the losses that had brought them to each other, but those losses no longer defined them. They had built something new from the ashes and the grief, something strong and lasting. In the summer of 1908, the whole family gathered at the ranch to celebrate Samuel and Victoria's 30th wedding anniversary. All 5 children were there with their spouses and children, filling the big house with noise and chaos. There were grandchildren running everywhere, 12 of them ranging from babies to teenagers. The table stretched the length of the porch for dinner, laden with food everyone had contributed. Samuel stood to make a speech, his voice still strong at 57. 30 years ago, Victoria and I stood in the church in town and made promises to each other. We were both broken people then, both grieving losses that seemed insurmountable. But we found each other, and we found a way forward together. We built this ranch, this family, this life, from nothing but hope and hard work and love. Looking around this table at all of you, our children and grandchildren, I can say without hesitation that every struggle was worth it. He turned to Victoria, who was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Victoria, you saved my life in every way that matters. You gave me a reason to keep breathing when I wanted to give up. You gave me this family, this home, this beautiful life. I love you more today than I did 30 years ago, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today. Victoria stood and took his hand. Samuel Foster, you are the best man I know. You took a frightened woman covered in soot and gave her a home and a purpose, and a love I never thought I would have. You honored my grief while helping me heal. You built this life with me, sharing the work and the joy equally. Everything good in my life came from choosing to trust you that day in Pecos. I love you, and I'm grateful for every day we've had together. Their children raised glasses in a toast, and the grandchildren cheered even though most of them didn't fully understand what was being celebrated. The party continued late into the night, with music and dancing and stories told around the fire pit Samuel had built years ago. Later, when the guests had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Samuel and Victoria walked out to the graves behind the house. They still tended them carefully, keeping the grass trimmed and the wooden crosses maintained. Samuel had carved proper headstones from granite a few years back, lasting markers for Margaret Thomas and William Foster. You think they know? Victoria asked, looking at the graves in the moonlight. About us, about the family we made, I think they know, Samuel said. And I think they're glad. Love doesn't diminish love. We didn't betray them by moving forward. We honored them by living well. Victoria leaned against him, and they stood in silence for a while, paying respect to the past while standing firmly in the present. Finally, they turned and walked back to the house, arms around each other, ready for bed and for tomorrow and for whatever came next. The ranch continued for generations, passed down through the family Samuel and Victoria built together. The story of how they met became family legend, told to children and grandchildren as an example of resilience and hope. The box Victoria saved from the fire was preserved and eventually donated to a museum in Denver, a testament to one woman's determination to honor her lost family. The house they built still stood over a century later, expanded and modernized but essentially unchanged. But all of that was in the future. In the present of 1908, Samuel and Victoria climbed into bed in the house they had built together, surrounded by the family they had created, and fell asleep holding hands as they had done for 30 years. They had lost everything that mattered once, both of them. Sickness and fire had stripped them bare, leaving them with nothing but grief and emptiness. But they had found each other in the wreckage, and together they had built something beautiful. They had found something to live for, not just survive for but truly live for. They had found love and purpose and hope, and they had created a legacy that would outlast them both. It wasn't the life either of them had planned. It wasn't the family Samuel had started with or the family Victoria had lost. But it was theirs, built with intention and care and unwavering commitment. It was a second chance neither of them had expected, but both had seized with both hands. And it was, in every way that mattered, exactly what they both needed. Samuel Foster and Victoria Summers. Foster lived long lives full of love and purpose. They saw their children and grandchildren prosper, watched the ranch they built become a cornerstone of the community, and faced the inevitable challenges of aging together with grace and humor. When Samuel passed away in 1924 at the age of 73, Victoria mourned him deeply, but not hopelessly. She had learned long ago that grief and gratitude could coexist, that you could miss someone terribly while still being thankful for the time you had together. Victoria lived another 8 years, surrounded by family, telling stories about the old days and the Wild West that had been tamed during her lifetime. She talked about the day a man pulled her from a burning building and how that moment of bravery had led to a lifetime of love. She talked about building a life from nothing, about choosing hope over despair, about honoring the past while embracing the future. When she died peacefully in her sleep in 1932 at the age of 76, her children buried her next to Samuel on the ranch they had built together. And if you looked closely at the headstone, carved into the granite below their names and dates, you would find words that captured everything they had learned and everything they had become. From ashes and sickness, we found each other. In love and purpose, we found life. It was a fitting epitaph for two people who had lost everything and then found everything again. Two people who proved that even the deepest grief could be survived, that even the most broken hearts could heal. Two people who showed that sometimes the worst moments of your life could lead to the best ones if you were brave enough to keep going, to keep trying, to keep hoping. Samuel and Victoria Foster had taken their tragedies and transformed them into triumph. They had honored their lost families by building a new one. They had faced their grief and their fear and had chosen love anyway. And in doing so, they had created something that lasted far beyond their own lives, a legacy of resilience and hope that echoed through generations. They had found something to live for together, and in the end, that made all the difference.